are going to be recording the meeting. It will be available on our YouTube channel. But I just want to thank you all for coming tonight and thank Bill for doing this program. He did a couple last year that were great, so we appreciate him coming back to do one on begin your vegetable garden. Just so you all know, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them at the end. We'll have time for questions and answers with Bill. But just so we keep the program going, we'll try to just get to them at the end. I think that's about it. So I will turn this over to Bill.
All right. Well, everyone, I'm hoping that this will be satisfactory in its presentation, and sometimes we have network troubles, and if we do, well, we may have to pull out the reserve slides, but we're optimistic tonight. So let me just quickly tell you about the Cooperative Extension set up by Congress in 1914 to move agricultural knowledge more directly to farmers. So every state in the United States has a land grant university usually that holds the cooperative extension program for that state. And it's URI in Rhode Island. And we've moved on from the agricultural focus to lots of other things, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. And Master Gardeners are one part of the university extension. We're volunteer people who take a semester of training and then do a certain number of volunteer hours to qualify as Master Gardeners. In my experience, it's a good education program. I started into it because my garden is mostly in view from the street, so people would walk by and ask questions, and I could answer some of them, but not enough to make me happy. So I did the course, and now I can answer more of them. And I get a few more answers every year. I figure it's about a 20-year process to get to the point where I could say Master Gardener with a straight face. But there's some mastery in what I do. So we have a gardening and environmental hotline, which is over on the left, and that is a resource that can be really helpful. If you're stuck with a problem, you can't figure out what's going wrong or why something's happening, you can call the hotline during the growing season or send email anytime. And you can send pictures, you can send explanations, and they'll be able to solve the problem or at least get close enough. Right. So this is essentially assuming that you have no particular experience with vegetable gardening. And the basic ideas are you can actually do this. It's, there's something about being a human being that makes it possible for us to do these things, even if we're not terribly comfortable with it right away. So if you give it some time, you need to get out in the garden most days, not necessarily every day. If you make a small start, and some days I think stay with a small start, then you can grow out from that. Usually a 4x4 or 4x8 plot is plenty to get you started. And most of what we're focusing on in organic gardening is growing the soil. So each year you add organic matter to the soil, you improve the environment for the microbes that live in the soil and generate most of the structure in the soil. And by adding compost and small amounts of fertilizer, you'll get very happy plants and the soil gets better every year as you go. And I have a resource package that I will share with you one way or another. And that has a list of a number of places to look for answers to questions or a little more experience. You don't have to catch everything that I say tonight, because you can find it in the resources. So the reason you would do this at all is that the quality of the vegetables is incomparable. You can get, by growing your own vegetables, you can get seeds that are heirloom varieties that, you know, your ancestors passed down. You know, a lot of the plants we grow were native to the United States, or to the New World, as we called it. And a lot of immigrants, even now, when they come to this country from wherever they're coming from, you know, bring seeds sewn into the seams in their clothing, in some cases, having been stopped for seeds. Did it voluntarily, but the agriculture department, especially in California, takes a very dim view of seeds coming in from any place else. But the immigrants did bring them along, and now we have big efforts to preserve all of the plant genetics that we can by saving their seeds very carefully in a number of places around the world. And so you can find things that are a little unusual. And it's fun to explore those. So you can get outside more, and you know that you're contributing to a little bit to food system resilience and soil health in the immediate plot that you're working. So every year we start out, we think about where should the garden be this year, and what do we want to grow, and how are we going to do that? And then you can basically go at this by planting seeds, planting nursery plants, and working your plot so that you have trellises and poles, really helpful for things like tomatoes, where if they can grow up, they do much better. Well, they certainly take up less space, put it that way. And you may need to find ways of excluding rabbits, woodchucks, deer, things like that, so that the provision of fencing can be an issue for gardens. In my area, we've had a lot of rabbits for the past few years. In areas where we have demonstration gardens, we've had woodchucks, and some places deer. Succession plantings. So some things like radishes, they'll grow fairly quickly, and you can pull them out and start something else. So each time you finish one, block of plants, you can prepare the ground again and put in something new. And it's a good idea to make frequent visits to the garden. So the first question is, when we look around, where is the sun going to be? If you're starting a new plot, what's the orientation of the sun? And if you sort of hold your arm up at about 75 degrees from your body, that's where the sun is going to go at the height of summer. And if you look, pretty much due south is a safe, gets you close enough to where the peak will be. Then you have a pretty good idea. If you can see no trees, and you're 10 feet away or more from buildings, this is mostly a caution for people with older houses. In Rhode Island, we used lead paint until about 1978. So there's chalking from the side of the building and lead deposits. It might be in the area immediately close to the building, and that drops off dramatically as you get further away from it. You want to be out of the root zone of any of the trees that are around. Trees are fierce competitors, and vegetables just, really can't outdo the reach of a maple tree. Fairly level is good. The southward slope gives you more sun exposure and is generally a good thing. And some place where water doesn't collect. So you may have a low-lying area on your property where it's sometimes a little bit wet and spongy. That's not a good place for the garden. So you want to be on slightly higher ground that's well drained, close to a water source so that you can water the plants. They need about an inch a week during the season. Some of that comes from rain, but you may have to supplement. And it's good to have the garden relatively close to the kitchen so that you don't have to go back and forth too much. So here's a sketch. So this particular plot is 25 feet from the building. It's about 20 feet wide, and there are 2 4-foot beds with a path in the middle. And if you look at the top bed layout, all of the really tall plants, yeah, I could probably run a cursor over this. Can you see that? Oh, good. All right. So up here, we've got things that are going to grow tall. And in front of those, things that aren't going to grow quite so tall. Although in the south, okra plants can reach 12 feet. They grow all the way through the winter. It's a remarkable thing to see a 12-foot okra plant. Anyway, that's basically the idea of this, is to make sure that you're well drained, you're oriented to the south, and you want to consider, if you've got wind at all, that what the typical direction of the wind is going to be. You might decide to put fencing between your plot and the source of the wind or direction of the wind. And just, like a picket fence will actually diffuse the wind, break the force of the wind, and it'll do it for several feet back from the fence. So if you find that your plants are just getting abused by the wind, you can mitigate that. All right. Keep a notebook. It's really important. Otherwise, you can't always remember where things are, and you want to remember from year to year where things were, because next year you want to put those same crop plants, the tomatoes, for example, someplace else. And a rotation plan is the sort of thing that you'll want to come up with. I'm going to emphasize this sort of central resource. This is a free home gardening manual from the University of Kentucky Extension program. It's extremely good, very well done, and very straightforward. And if you read the first 10 pages of this book, you'll be in great shape. It's about 50 pages long, and it's available online. If you just do a search or you look it up in the resource pack, you'll find it quickly. And it goes into site selection in a very nice way. Keeping the notes, though, is good. Right. This is a guide to when to plant things. We're going to have a little bit more time on this in a bit, but just for right now, what we're looking at is month by month by month, what things can be started indoors. So we're now almost in the time when we can start to put our cucumbers into seed frames and start to grow those. And then there are things that you can seed directly into the soil. So right now, if the soil is workable, you can seed carrots and endive and things that are on the second page of this, in particular, things like peas. Other things have to wait longer. But we're very close now to beets, and then the beans are second half of May. So that's seeding, and for every start indoors, there's a transplant date as well, when it's safe to put them outside. Generally, it's for the peppers and tomatoes and things, it's best to wait until June to get those outdoors. Anyway, this is a thing that you can use to figure out when you're going to put what in the ground. And once you've decided what things you're going to grow and what your providers, who you're going to get them from, there are seed catalogs everywhere. If you give your name to one of them, others will begin to arrive as well. And every seed packet that is aimed at home gardeners has quite a lot of information, like how long it's going to take to maturity, what temperature range it likes for germinating. So this green onion essentially will take reasonably cool soil. 50 degrees is good, but it'll tolerate growing in warmer soil too, after the sun's really had a chance to warm things up. You want to plant them about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch deep, 1 inch apart, and then thin them out to 2 inches apart. And it'll give you some culinary tips if you're lucky. There is cultivation help and information. But if you need more information than this, you can often, and actually typically, find that in the seed catalog operators' websites. So, we buy a lot of seeds from Johnny's Seeds in Maine, and their information on the plants is profoundly adequate. And there are books that are really good. So lots of ways of finding out, if you're in any doubt at all, how to deal with the seeds and where to put them. And if you're thinking of containers, then the important things are to use a soilless potting mix. So this is usually peat moss or peat moss substitute with vermiculite, perlite perhaps, and it will support the plant's roots and stems through the growing season. You need to find a container, and this illustration is based on, it's a very crude illustration, it's based on 5-gallon buckets. You'll sometimes see a row of 5-gallon buckets behind a restaurant where they're growing herbs, and that it works perfectly well. So you can grow beans, tomatoes, all sorts of things. You need to make drain holes in them so the water doesn't settle. Check the water daily, because the wind will dry them out quickly. And read the seed packets to figure out how densely you can do these things. Also, there are several references on how to deal with containers. The reason that we want to do soilless soil in containers is that the ground in your garden actually has a very deep profile, and each of these layers drains the upper layers. And in a container, if you put garden soil into the container, it will tend to just clump up and become more like concrete than soil, and it will give your plants trouble. So, and just quickly, if you look here, this is the humus layer at the very top, and then gradually into subsoil layers until you get down to things that are mostly rock and then purely rock. So humus, which is the rich layer of topsoil at the very top, and in some places it's actually quite deep, is what gives, it's the spongy soil. So if you are in a forest and you peel back the debris that hasn't yet been decomposed, you'll find that it's spongy, at least a little bit damp, and it's full of microorganisms busy decomposing things that fall from the trees, things that fall over, grasses and other plants. And they knit it together into complex structure of cells and pathways that holds water in bubble form, in surface tension. As water flows through the soil, the humus will retain a fair amount of that. And it also holds nutrients that would otherwise just be washed through. And it's where most of the live organisms in the soil are home. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, but basically what makes the structure is the bacteria and microbes generally that stitch together the bits of debris using the glue that's on their surfaces. And the bacteria use that glue to keep themselves attached to something so that they don't get washed away every time it rains. And they build these structures of material. And British botanist and his graduate students, no doubt, took the whole 3 tablespoons of soil and unpicked every piece of every little convolution. And it amounted to about a city block of surface by the time they got done with that, which is, anyway, that's how it manages to hold those nutrients and water and all that. So what we do is add compost, fertilizer, and mulch. The compost provides microbes and some amount of humus that the microbes have worked on, and some nutrients. We also add fertilizer and we add mulch to the top of the soil, at least in the fall, and till it gently. Once you've got a plot started, you just need to waggle a fork in it to loosen things up so that you can plant. Right, so here are the animals. And if you look down here, these are the big numbers in a meter, cubic meter. And they're complex interactions. And we know comparatively little about these things. Several years ago, there was an expedition for a weekend to, check soil in various parts of Central Park, and the huge number of undiscovered organisms were found and cataloged and named in that exercise. Nobody had known they were in existence, and their structure in colonies was also an unknown thing. So if it's an area of interest for you, you can find material on that, but it certainly is important in the soil. So the way we care for it is we add compost, mulch, and we disturb it minimally. So if you're going to start a new bed, you could consider double digging. You basically take the top layer and lift it off, and then you take a fork and you work another shovel depth with the fork, spade depth with the fork, and then you pile the next piece of soil onto that, and so on. And that process is usually enough to kick off a very good garden bed. And if you treat that well and add compost and nutrients and keep it protected in winter with a layer of mulch, you're off and running. Yeah, so for mulch, after the plants are established, you can add mulch on the surface of the soil, and this kind of keeps some of the pests away. It deters weeds, keeps the soil moist and cool, and all of that. Water, it's important to get an inch a week. Some plants may need more than that or less. You can find that guidance with each of the varieties of plant. And if you need a rain gauge, you can use a can and then go out and poke a ruler in it and see how much rain you've had. Dump it out and get another reading the next week. So this is about it. In the autumn, it's very important to protect the soil from the rages of winter. So piling a few inches of chopped up leaves is good. And then in the spring, you rake this all aside, the parts, set it aside, and then you can work the soil and start planting. Also, once you've got the bed established, it's a good idea, if you can avoid it, to not step on the bed because it compresses the soil structure. Okay. Testing your soil is a really good idea, especially if you're opening up a new garden. We opened one up a few years ago, a demonstration garden that we operate in Warwick. And I did soil samples on that plot, and we discovered that the lead level across the plot in one large area was really dangerous, and the other one was even more dangerous. And the more dangerous one basically had a warning that you should keep children away from this soil. Don't let them play here. So if you have that, there are ways of mitigating that. You basically put down a very dense fabric of root protection, essentially is what it's called, and then build a raised bed on top of that with soil that's not contaminated. The URI extension does free pH tests. In this part of the country, we have typically acid soil. It's not uncommon to see pH ratings in about the 5 range. And what vegetable plants typically like is something between 6.5 and 7, very close to neutral. So if you have a pH problem, you can correct that over a period of a year or so. And then there's a fee for testing of nutrients and lead and things of that sort. You can find the soil test labs at UConn and UMass in the resources section. They'll tell you how to collect the soil sample and how to send it to them. So then they'll also provide explicit directions about how much of any given nutrient you should add to the soil. All right. And the reason you want to get the pH right is if you look here at a pH of about 5, what happens is these nutrients get bound up in forms that make them inaccessible to the plant roots. Where if you're in this sort of 6.5 to 7.5 range, virtually all the nutrients are easily available to the plants. So even if you've got an oversupply of nitrogen, if you're down in this range, you're going to have trouble, and so on with the minerals. All right, so you can grow some things from seeds and plant them in the ground. There are some things that you can either start early because then you'll get a better yield, or some things like the tropical plants, peppers, tomatoes, eggplant, where they need the time to have a successful season in Rhode Island, in New England. And if you don't start them inside or buy them at a nursery where the nursery people have started them in the greenhouse, you're just not going to make it by planting those seeds. Well, I take it back. Some varieties will do all right. I had a variety of cherry tomatoes that reseeded themselves every year for about 4 years running, and they always produced fruit. So there are some things that are quick enough, and if you've got them in a southern exposure, will be a little quicker. All right. Now, and then some things you can grow from last year's harvest pretty much straightforwardly. So seed potatoes, if you capture them from the potatoes you grew last year. Garlic is straightforward. If you can buy seed garlic, but the way that you start garlic is to take the bulb apart into cloves and plant the cloves. Okay, and then a little more on the planting calendar. If there are any confusions about this or any questions, I think it's reasonably straightforward, but this then becomes your roadmap for all of the things that you want to grow. And that pretty much ties up your planning. You'll need a few tools. If you're working with a container, you probably don't need very much in the way of tooling, but you'll almost always need, shears, a bypass pruner, sort of got curved blades, and maybe a weeder. If you're working in a raised bed, you may be able to deal with all of the chores with small hand tools. You need some kind of way of getting water to the plants, a hose, watering can. It's good to have gloves for working in the soil. Labels are really important. Labeling the seeds that you start in little containers indoors is really important, because you think you might remember them, but it actually turns out that it's very difficult. Once they get started, they all look the same. Well, not entirely the same, but many of these plants, they're really quite different, look alike. Twine for tying things up. Notebook and pencil, I think, is really fundamental. You're going to see a lot of things, and if you make notes of them, that will help you in later years. And it will also help you with things like crop rotations and some basic reference material, so that if you get a question you're not sure about, you can kind of quickly look it up or call the hotline. That also works. And this is the University of Kentucky Extension publication on home gardening, and it is remarkably good, as I say. And they update this frequently, well, every year or two, which is pretty frequent. Okay, so what we're doing is minimizing the use of highly concentrated fertilizers, but using a dilute liquid fertilizer or light applications of granular fertilizers, following the specific plant advice. If you're confused about how to get to the amount you need for a square foot, as opposed to the amount that's listed on the package for acres, there's a very helpful guide on the University of Connecticut's soil test website that explains how to subdivide those quantities so that you can get it down to the sort of square foot level. Pesticides. So the problem with most garden pests is that there are straightforward ways of dealing with them once you know what they are, and once you know that they're not actually helpful pests, helpful bugs. So it's, if you can possibly do it, holding off on the pesticides, herbicides is a good thing. And if you're stuck and not sure what to do, please call the hotline and they will help you. So we've talked a little bit about no-till planting. Basically, once the humus is working and developed, you want to disturb it only minimally with moving it around a little bit with a fork, but not lifting it up and all of that, which is no criticism of people who pretty much need to work with tillers, but even then, machinery is being developed, has been developed now for no-till planting, and farmers are using it increasingly. Compost. You can make it yourself, you can purchase it, but you should apply it about 1 inch on the soil each year and rake it in. There are some elements of the resources that point you in various directions, but you will you'll find, I think, the far and away the best thing I know on worm composting is this under 10-minute video from the University of Maine. If you'd like to try composting with worms, you can watch that and it will tell you everything you need to know to get going and to keep it going. And there are similar guides around that are good on you know, composting in bins and containers. Good stuff. And there's lots of other areas that you can start to explore. You know, once you're engaged, the seed starting and saving are areas where we offer talks. You can find out about pollinators and native plants, and there are lots of directions to go from the start. So one of the really important things to have in your garden is a place to sit, because if you don't sit down, you're prone to just working in the garden. And if you sit down, then you'll see more and actually enjoy it a lot more. So that's, I've got a little bit here on the resources. You should take a look at the University Extension Outreach Center pages for resources that may be of interest and value to you. And you know, there's a plant protection clinic. So if you have a problem with plant tissue that you just can't make any sense of, and the hotline people can't make any sense of it, they'll hand it to the people who do tissue analysis on the plants. And the Master Gardener program operates a bunch of demonstration gardens like this one in Roger Williams Park. There are lots of things that you can learn from talks and workshops and stuff. And we do a free seed distribution every year. Basically, last year's seeds that are it's no longer legal to sell them the next year. So those come to us and we redistribute them in a partnership with Ocean State Job Lot. Right. So that's, the native plant guide is another thing that you'll find on the extension website, worth a look. So now, if you have any questions at all, we can kind of go through those.
Yeah, I don't see any in the chat, but if anybody does have a question, feel free to unmute yourself. And
Hi, I did have a question just about, I have a raised bed, but it was getting very wet because of I used a weed cloth in the bottom.
Oh, right.
So then last year I did make some like vent hole type things in the bottom of the weed cloth to try to let it drain. And I've read different things like mixing potting soil in with to lighten it up, or sand, or what would you recommend?
Vermiculite is really good. Perlite is really good.
Okay.
Lightening it up with peat moss will certainly help. And probably working more compost into it will gradually improve it as well. But
Okay.
sometimes the very fine weave of the weed cloth will plug with small particles and give you
Yes.
kind of problem. Weep holes around the edges of the red bed would probably also give you some relief there.
What was the last thing? I'm sorry.
Little weep holes, you know, either something just above the soil, a tube, or, you know, similar device that will let water drain out could be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Bill, someone in the chat asked about, do you have any advice about pruning tomatoes?
Yes. All right. So what happens with the tomato plant is the first thing you need to know is there are both determinate and indeterminate types. Well, determinate means they grow up to a certain height and that's it. So if you're growing determinate tomatoes, be very cautious about pruning them because that's all they're going to do. And then there are the indeterminates, which are more common, and where, you know, if you're growing them in a greenhouse, you know, they'll grow 12 feet and then climb over the top rung and start down the other side of the trellis. So in the in general, you want to try to limit the vines that really develop as very strong vines. The standard recommendation is one vine, but the tomatoes like to produce additional vines as they go. And they'll produce that either from the root cluster, or more normally, they'll, wherever they're, look for there's a leaf that grows out of the plant. And between that leaf and the stem, there's a little suggestion of a vine that's going to start there. And if you catch those before they get to be really big, you know, if they're sticking out maybe half an inch to an inch, you can just clip those off. But it's important to clip those off unless you want to see how luxuriant the tomato plant can be, because they will become then vines of their own, and they'll need nutrition that could have gone to producing fruit in one main stem. And generally it's recommended that you keep it down to one stem and keep all of the little suckers, attempts to start new vines from developing. Long answer, but if that's helpful.
Yes, thank you. Another question in the chat. Someone tried growing loofah last year, got lots of loofah, but it never dried out properly on the vine. Any tips?
I'm afraid it's not a plant that I know. So I recommend that you get in touch with the hotline people, send them some email. They'll figure out what you need to know, and they'll get back to you with answers.
Okay. Thank you. Another person, that person thanked you. What about dark spots on tomato plants that occur when plant is producing fruit? No.
Yes. Okay. So this is on the vines, on the leaves. And
Does
my best advice.
It's me. It's Fran Pepin. It happens on the leaves, as I did it last year and the year before, and all of a sudden there was dark spots on the leaves, just as the plant were beginning to ripen, almost like the plant was prematurely dying.
Okay. There are lots of varieties of tissue problems that you run into with plants. If you can get a picture of that, or if you want to call our hotline people and try to describe it to them, they'll no doubt ask you 20 questions to pin it down. But that's what I'd recommend. There are resources that will show a number of pictures of disease conditions. And if you can identify one that looks to you like the one that you had, then that's your best way of finding what it actually was. So, you know, it's the density of the spots, the extent of them, things like that you would want to know in order to get to the answer. But I'd encourage you to take a look either in reference books, sort of reference e-books on things that go wrong with the plants. You generally find these in the public libraries in the state, enough information to get you what you need. And you can always call our hotline and they will work you through it.
Someone asked, are there any flowers other than marigolds that you would suggest to complement the typical vegetable garden?
Marigolds are great because they have fairly strong scent and they confuse the insects. You know, I don't know, we grow a lot of different flowers around the plants, generally intermixed. Echinacea is good. had stands of that. But different flowers, so long as they're not competing directly with the vegetable plants, there are some. You can take a look at companion planting guides. Another thing to look for. The marigolds are excellent for most of the vegetables. They do a great job with tomatoes, and it's not a subject on which I have a great deal of expertise, but my experience has been that pretty much every sort of flower that we've planted near the vegetables has been fine. The vegetables have been fine.
Thank you. Someone asked about the best way to trim kitchen herbs for use all season long. Theirs doesn't seem to last. So any advice?
Okay. Yeah, so there are two elements to that, and one is getting the cutting at the right stage of its development, when it's full of resins or whatever it is that we're after with that particular cutting. So there are times, and you can find information about that in books on herbs and saving herbs. And then there's a drying process that's typically also involved. So bundling them and hanging them is a technique that I've seen. Air drying them, there are dryers that essentially blow warm air up through a stack of trays that hold the herbs, and that works. And there are all sorts of instructions for how to build your own, and places that will sell them to you if you're interested in that kind of drying process. That's what I know, but I would say there are some good books that I've looked at on raising herbs and drying them, and I would encourage you to take a look at those. Or again, call the hotline. That's what they're there for.
And there's one more question. How do you protect squash leaves from forming white powdery substance on them?
Right, those are usually mildew. So it's, but it, I'm going to have to ask you, because it's really a bad idea to speculate. So I'm going to tell you, call the hotline. The things that I've experienced mostly with squashes that are I had a terrible time with squash vine borers, and I cured that by by moving the plants and covering them up and starting them later in the ground and things like that. So if you ever have a problem with that, I'm quite good on that now. But I've not had a lot of trouble with other leaf diseases among the squashes, so it's not an area of real expertise for me. And I wish I could give you an answer right now, but I can tell you, if you send email to the hotline people, they will give you some good advice.
It's a great resource. So
yeah, well, they say they've got a lot of information at their fingertips with the computer systems, and they also have botanists that are part of the University Extension program that they can ask who are nearby. So it's really hard to beat.
Yeah. Good. Does anyone else have any other questions? I don't see any in the chat or anything else. Well, thank you, Bill. I